Welcome to Creative Leadership with Heart, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of creative leadership. I'm your host, Rico Nasol. Join me as we explore the transformative impact of heart-centered leadership in today's creative and design organizations. All right. Welcome back. We got Parth Bhawalkar, one of my really good friends from back in the day. He is now the global design lead at Cash App. And if you haven't heard of Cash App, you probably should have. You're probably living under a rock, but they are in financial services. They do peer-to-peer, crypto trading and such. So welcome, Parth. Thanks for being here with me. Thanks for chatting.
Thank you for having me, Rico. It's been a while.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your creative journey. Where are you at? How did you get where you are?
Wow, yeah. I guess I started my creative journey many years ago. I think as a child, I was a very creative individual. I drew, I painted. That was sort of the first skill that I think people knew me for. I was known as the one who could draw. But like growing up, especially in India, which is where I'm from, you're sort of told very early on in life that you have to pick a practical career if you have to make it in life. And so, I had to sort of move away from this creative side of me to a more, process engineering side of me, which was, I had to get good at math and science and, how to pick a practical career in engineering. And so, that was sort of the shift that happened over time, and I lost that side of me. But I always sort of remembered that, there was this creative, and empathetic, emotional side that I had, which I think is so critical in, being a successful creative. Like, I think you need to think differently. And so anyway, as I started my career as an engineer, I wrote backend code. I was actually a developer for a few years, and it's funny, I gave up I passed on a very high, not high paying, but it was like a very corporate job, in an Indian company. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to work on something that is interesting and different and, actually affects everyday people. And I don't know if you remember, but back in the day before iPhones, we had AOL and MSN and Yahoo messengers, and that's how we communicated with all our friends. And I worked on a chat product called a Mundu Messenger, and it was this thing that brought together all these platforms into one product, and I could chat with friends with that, right, with that tool. And I didn't have to have a Yahoo ID. I could have an MSN ID and talk to a friend who had a Yahoo ID. So it was really unique in that sense. And I think working there, I realized I loved building products. I loved making something. What I didn't like was that I was the one making it and not deciding why we made it or who we made it for. And so this was again back before design was a known career choice. Like, designers didn't really exist in that form. There was sort of this, you're a visual designer and then you're an engineer, but there was nothing in between that translated these like business and user needs into what a good product looked like. And so that really got me thinking, how do I change this? How do I change this equation where I know how to make stuff, but I really want to be designing. I want to be making it for people because I didn't see that in the conversation. And so I made the career choice. I actually switched. I went to school. I actually came to the US for graduate school. That's how I got into design. I studied psychology, design, tech in a program called Human Computer Interaction on the East Coast. And yeah, I sort of really, it made me realize that design is about so much more than just pixels. I remember my first sort of project, it was like, don't even think about design until you've identified the problem that you want to solve for. And yeah, that was like mind blowing to me. Just not thinking about a solution is so hard, right? We all want to jump into it. But that is an aspect of design and creative that really got me excited. And so my journey from engineering to design sort of happened that way.
Yeah. So, well, there's a lot to get into there.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I did want to follow up on, and we'll talk a bit about this first, and then I'd love to get into kind of your approach to product design. But we have similar backgrounds, right? Like I
Sure.
have I'm first generation. You were in India, but we have this the same. I think it's like an
Yeah.
Asian culture thing, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like doctor, lawyer, right, engineer, You can
100%.
be it's basically that you can be anything you want as long as it's a doctor, a lawyer, or engineer, right?
As
um,
long as you're making the money.
yeah. So how did that impact you growing up? Like in a negative way,
Hmm.
positive way? What things did that help you do or hurt you do in your career?
It's a good question. I think in many ways it made me reject or give up on options that I could have gotten into, right? Like I was a good artist. Maybe that was a great career choice for me. Maybe I could have gotten into music. I could have gotten into something a little less traditional, right? And I quickly had to give that up, like at very a young age. So it definitely made me sort of pick and choose. But also in some ways made me realize, that life is about picking and choosing. It is about making practical choices sometimes. Um, so it's not, it gives you survival instinct. And I think that it's necessary in life to have that, like especially as an immigrant, you have very different experiences coming to a new country, learning how to live and, adapt. And I think that those skills, like, I think having those made me a lot stronger. And it also made me more resilient, in the ever-changing world that we live in with, economies growing and shrinking and like going through job losses and things like that, even personally, right? So I think it kind of had I think it serves its purpose. I think you go through life for a reason, you go through experiences for a reason, and you learn from all of them. They all make you who you are. So I'd be remiss in saying that if I wish I hadn't gone through it, but it also made me who I am. So
Yeah, exactly right. It's who we are today. So whether we like things or not or whatever, want to go change things, it like things would have been different. Um,
exactly.
and that implies that maybe we don't like where we are, but you've been super successful. I've worked with you and I've seen
Yeah.
you. So
Thank
okay.
you.
So wanting to go into kind of your creative process, 'cause you said it was interesting that you said like, you learned early on to not start with the solution,
Yeah.
or start with the design. You
Yeah.
start with the problem. So walk me a little bit through like how your creative process and how you go about even prototyping or thinking of the first version of a product.
It really depends on the situation, right? I think that people are visual and it depends on sort of who your audience is and what you're trying to get across. So I always look at I don't like to be very sort of I don't have this dogma that I have to do this and this is the only way to do this. I think you have to adapt to the situation. Um, if you sort of follow a route and say, well, I have to prove to you why this is important, and I don't show you what that looks like, then I've lost you, right? Your audience matters, how you communicate to them matters. And so, usually that is sort of the first step is like, who am I doing this for? Who is the audience? Is it going to be a skeptical executive? Is it going to be, a very welcoming, eager audience because they've already understood that design brings something to the table? And I think I would shift my narrative and approach based on that. So, you know, if you look at the ideal like design process, it is understand, right? Like you want to understand what it is that you need to build. Why are you building it? So you're doing your user research, you're understanding, the markets, the people, the business problem. You're coming up with the opportunity, and then you sort of move away from this sort of very process and research like thinking into what is creative, which is that's where the magic happens. There's no one way to do it. It's where you bring in experience, you bring in insight, and that there's no sort of formula for. And that's where I think design is so important, is because it allows you to experience and explore things that are not in the textbook or
Mhm.
are not defined for you. You're bringing that. Um, so that's sort of how I like to think about it, which is, obviously do your homework, understand the problem. Like, don't get ahead of yourself because often people like to think, oh, I know how to solve this. We can build this tool and it'll do it for us. And you've automatically just like taken away an opportunity where you could have redefined something. You could have come up with something completely unique and different, which you haven't even understood or, given yourself the time to think about. So that's sort of the creative process that I like to follow, which is, give yourself the time to really challenge the problem and like define it. Because you'll always have, time to design and come up with iterations. But yeah, I'd say that is sort of my typical process. Like know your audience, understand the problem, and then go at it. Give yourself the freedom, the creative freedom to make mistakes, try things, and then get feedback. That is like the most important thing, which is you can build this creative muscle through that act of doing and iterating, which I think a lot of designers don't do
Mhm.
because they feel like they're afraid of feedback, or they think you have to get it right before you can you have to prove yourself, right? Like if I
Yeah.
do a shitty job, I'm not going to get I'm already like lost the battle. And in reality, you just need to do the work, try, and be open and
Yeah.
humble to feedback.
That's a great point. Something I do wanna almost reminisce, and I
Mhm.
saw that process firsthand when we worked together, right? It would
Yeah,
we would weeks, we would research, whiteboard,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then define the problem before you would even come to me with any sort of design solution.
yeah,
It's because we wanted to make sure that whatever we were building was the right thing to build. And I think earlier
totally.
in our careers, we're like, "Oh, just build me something that does this." That because we were so like high achieving, we think we know the answers, right? So build me something that does this. And then when you
Yeah,
start to work on it, you're like, you built something that did this, but if we understood the problem holistically, we could build something that could do way more stuff and could be more valuable for longer periods of time, right?
totally.
And I
Yeah.
worked on things with you firsthand in that way. Um, but one thing I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit, you said this fear of feedback, and as creatives, like I think I know this is a real thing because I've had this too. But can you talk about where that comes from for you? Maybe you can't speak for
Mm.
other people, but where does that fear of feedback, like what does that trigger for you?
Uh, I think it comes from misalignment, right, on expectations. In my case, if I'm, say, pushing something off, or I'm not sure how to proceed, or I don't know if I want to, go ahead and showcase something that I worked on, it's because I have this understanding that, or I have this notion that people know more than I do. And if I show them something that they already know, then I'm going to be laughed at, or they're going to sort of ridicule me or say, like, why did we hire you? You should be surprising us, right? So I think it's that first is that it's that misalignment. It's that fear that you somehow are going to be you're less knowledgeable about this topic than they are. And that's again a problem where we think we always sort of project what others are feeling when in reality they're not thinking about you. They're not thinking about your problems. They have their own stuff to deal with. So it's often I've found that if I've just done the work, it's all about just starting somewhere, right? Um, Building that momentum. And if you do it early enough, um, you showcase your work, whether it's in a rough format or you bring it to one person, bring it to two people, get feedback. You start to realize that you actually have a lot of value to offer because you're there for a reason, right? Like, don't discount that. You're there for a reason. Your skills were obviously impressive enough that someone took a chance on you, however senior you are. But showing the work, bringing in people, getting feedback early, and is sort of so important because I think that's when you realize you get that confidence. It's by doing. I think that is what people tend to forget is that you have to do the work. And far too often we feel like we have to have the perfect solution. We have to show like this 100% thing. Well, that's not true. There's never such a thing as 100%. Nothing is perfect. What you show to someone tomorrow could be obsolete in a month because the world changes.
Mhm.
So why do you think you're going to have a perfect solution, right? So that's kind of what I think people need to forget is like feedback is not personal. It is about something that you're solving. And often they don't know as much as you do because you've done the work. You know more than they do, right? And so
Yeah.
you're educating people. So always go into it with that mindset that you're going to tell something to someone that they don't already know.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think that's the approach to take.
That's a great point, right? Like early and often, right? So
Mhm.
because to
Yeah,
your point, like when there's usually critical feedback is when there's misalignment, but if you're sharing
yeah,
early and often, right, the opportunities to catch that misalignment there's more, it's more
totally.
abundant, right? So you can pivot or do whatever you need to do. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, for a lot of creatives, I know this was for me, putting your work out there is like putting yourself out there, right? And once we can get better about removing ourselves, like our personal attachments to our work, because our work is what we do, it's not us, right?
totally.
So once we can remove our personal attachment to that, it's not like When I put a creative asset out there or put a design out there, it's me standing in front of the world asking for feedback on me. It's just
Exactly.
something that I did based on something that needed to get done, based on a spec or based
Yeah.
on something. So I think that's where we get hung up. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because a lot of people, they just tie those things together. I am what I do. And we were
Exactly.
talking before we started recording, right? Like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
just had, your son's 17 months,
Hmm.
and you had this realization that you aren't what you do, right? Who
No.
you are is much bigger than what I do. What I do is just what supports my lifestyle and
Yeah.
like what gives me money and what all that stuff, but it's not really who I am.
No, no, because that could go away, and it also defines you as this is it. This is what you're limited to. We're so much more than that. I'm a designer, but why? Well, that doesn't mean that I can't become something else or take on other skills and keep growing. We're not boxed in. We
Yeah.
need to stop thinking as that.
What would you say was the maybe biggest challenge or biggest hurdle that you had to get over across your career so far?
Beyond the fact that I was on visas and had to, take jobs based on who would sponsor me. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Um,
that's hard. That's a logistical thing, right? Like that's
that's logistics, right?
yeah.
But it's funny because it is in some ways very, there's something about, where people forget that having that experience means that you really value when you get the jobs that you really, value that you've come across that are just so rare to get. Like when we worked at Netflix, to me that was I really valued that because you know I could have done it when I was a new immigrant to this country or a student, if they had, because maybe they wouldn't have sponsored visas at the time, whatever that may be. But when you get it, you really appreciate it. I think the biggest challenges for me have been early on in my career. Design was never a didn't have a seat at the table, right? It was always the conversation was always around proving the value of design and why design should exist. I still remember there was this graph somebody had worked on, and they literally like had plotted, companies that had taken a design first approach to product making. Obviously, you have Apple, Google, some of the Silicon Valley giants at the time, and they sort of looked at their market performance over time, and they compared it to companies that didn't have that, or didn't have sort of a formal approach or design process or design team. And there was like a clear delta between these companies that had the design, that had design as a formalized function or recognize the value of design as a differentiator. Um, but we would have to scrape up all these bits of information to try to prove that we have value, because it was always like business, right? It was business analysts and product managers were the ones who
Mhm.
sort of were the value adds, and we were kind of supporting their mission. I think in some cases it still happens today, but I'd say that is the hardest part for designers, to be taken seriously. In some ways, we've kind of done it to ourselves because we painted ourselves as a creator, as artists, where we're not really that. We should be business thinkers. But even early on in my career, like when proving the value of design was my biggest problem, I had to do that. It was, how do I deliver value? How do I prove that what I'm doing is not just some frivolous piece of artwork that I'm producing that is going to help somebody achieve a task? There's going to be a benefit, a business improvement, whether I do it through user research and I get data that supports why something needs to happen, or we sort of build something and then leverage revenue as a way to support why what we did made a difference. And I've had to do that. It wasn't that I could just take it for granted that I would be called upon to do a project. There had to be, I had to prove myself, and I noticed today I don't have to do that as much. It's like we have leaders who are in design. We have VPs in design, chief design officers at Cash App, for example. So in some ways that function has been like taken care of, but I think that was the hardest part, was just getting a seat at the table.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that you're right, those days are gone, but I work with a lot
Yeah,
of people that that's what they're struggling with right now. Like, how does
true.
design get a seat at the table, right? And it's to your point,
Yep.
and we do it to ourselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We do have to. It's on us to educate what good design looks like, right,
Yeah.
when it happens, right? And design's not just the icing on the cake, it's an
No.
ingredient to actually make a good cake.
Yeah.
So if you
Yeah.
wanna make a good cake, design has to be foundational, it has to be in there. It can't just be the
100%.
icing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's great advice, and it is still a challenge, and I'm glad you found a place that so there are places that still value design or that value design in general, and creative. Um, one thing I wanna to ask, I know we're coming up at time, but a couple more questions. One is, who is a leader or mentor that actually impacted your career, and, like, what things did you learn from them?
That's a tough question. And I've been thinking about it a lot because, I always want to equate my success with the acts or the influence of a single person. And I rarely find that that's true. I think that, yeah, you may be lucky or you have a mentor or you have somebody that you've sort of been working with for a long time or built a relationship with that can guide you. I've had the opposite. I actually feel like I have many people that I have to thank who are responsible for who I am, right? I think obviously I can't say enough about my parents being the first influences in my life who are the reason I am who I am today, and for my flaws and my positive traits. But then, even in my career, I think I have focused on building meaningful relationships with everybody I work with. And I think that has been the key to how I have been able to get to the next role that I've gotten to. It's because of building these positive relationships, learning from individual, like, Rico, you are working with you at Netflix, like seeing how you built an organization that scaled the company globally. Like, I took pieces of inspiration from you. You were in some ways unofficially a mentor without knowing it. The same goes for people at other companies. They were friends, colleagues, but I would see how they would do things, and I would sort of take inspiration from that. I don't have to copy it. I think you should develop your own style. I think leadership
Mhm.
is about that. It is about learning from people, but ultimately coming up with what works for you and your authentic self. Um, so I'd say like that's really been for me the journey, building these relationships through, mutual respect, humility, building empathy, uh, all of these things. I think it'd be hard pressed for me to find like one person. I think everybody I've worked with, in some capacity has been a mentor. And that's how I've approached it. I'm a
Yeah.
result of many, many, many people, many experiences, having influenced me.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, and it's true, right? Like, every interaction, whether positive or negative, has some sort of lasting effect on you in some
100%.
way, shape, or form. Um, and thank you for the kind words. Uh,
Absolutely.
um, so this question is either for your younger self or folks that are now, like, trying to build career on shoulders of the ones that came before them. What advice would you give to your younger self or creatives that are just getting started?
Uh, that's a really great question. Because I keep doing this to myself every day. I'm like giving myself advice every day because I want to be better tomorrow than I am today. And I don't think I'm at a point where I feel like I'm like, I'm past the point of my prime. So I feel like what I say here is probably going to apply both to me now as well as my past self, and also to anybody who's an aspiring designer or you're early in your career and struggling. I'd say be fearless. Take risks. I think far too often we're afraid of consequences, whether it's a job loss or you think you might upset somebody, or you're afraid that your voice may not be heard or you may sound stupid. Take risks. Be bold. Be fearless. I mean, when I say that, don't be a jerk, but don't be afraid is what I mean to say. Like, give yourself that opportunity because you'll regret it in the future, and these become habits that self perpetuate. Um, don't always be curious. Don't ever let your role define what you do and who you are. I think curiosity is necessary for growth. Always ask questions. Don't take it because it was told to you. And the biggest thing I can say, and I feel like I still like go through this and I have to remind myself every day, because I think we all do in some capacity, but imposter syndrome is easily defeatable. And you do it by just doing the work and doing the work, pushing little by little. We talked earlier about feedback. That is the best way you can defeat that sort of feeling of I'm not good enough, is by showing the work you're doing, by asking for feedback, by collaborating. It's in isolation that we feel that. It is by listening to these voices in our head that you're not good enough, when that's not the true story, right? Like, that's a narrative we're building. And how do you defeat that? You talk to people, you show stuff, you get feedback, you get better. And I think, over time, you realize that this is just a narrative you keep spinning. So, I struggled with that for a lot of my career. And I feel like I wish I told myself this, that you can defeat it. It's a thing we feel, and we sort of think is, we're sort of always going to be doomed to sort of face, but that's not true. It is something that is easy to overcome. We just have to keep reminding ourselves that we have to get outside our box, and that's
Hmm.
that's that's the that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised, maybe not surprised. Gallup even said 70% of people deal with it. And like,
Yeah,
it's such a big thing because I think, especially in environments we're in, because there's this emphasis on high performance, right? And
true.
self-proclaimed, right? I want to work at Netflix because I'm a high performer. I want to work here because I'm
Right,
a high performer. I
right.
want to work with the best of the best. But then we don't think of ourselves as the best of the best. We think
No,
of everyone across the table as the best of the best, and then we say, "Well, why am I here?
yeah,
Like, why do I belong here? I'm not that smart."
yeah.
But in
I mean,
actuality, like, everyone else thinks you're the smartest at the table, and they're
exactly.
like, "Why am I here?" Right?
Yeah,
Like you mentioned it earlier, projecting, right? Like
yeah,
most people will project their insecurities onto everyone else. So when we feel like we're not the smartest at the table, it's because, or why we're projecting everyone thinks we're not smart, is because we don't think we're smart ourselves. And it's
yeah,
to your point, it's an absence of feedback. It's the story that we tell ourselves. Like it's all inner narrative that brings
yeah.
us down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I think we put a lot of undue pressure on ourselves to be these, like you said, self starters and high performers. Like, high performers are actually, in a football team. Think about a sports team analogy, right? Like, you could be the best quarterback, and your team, the rest of the team around you may not work well with you. Well, does that work? No, it doesn't, right? The team suffers. But the teams that are most successful are the ones who work well together. So even in the sense of imposter syndrome, it is not just you that's the problem. It's like your team has to work with you. So, what's that saying? If you want to go far, go together. But if you want to go fast, go alone. So it's like it's really about working well with people and not sort of isolating yourself in this world where I have to prove to others that I am like this rock star. I think we have to kill this term rock star. I really do. I feel like the most successful bands, they never did well solo, because rock stars, like, you don't have the same
Hmm.
success. I mean, look at the Beatles, right? None of
Yeah.
the individual performers could replicate the same level of success as they could together. And I think that is like the greatest analogy for a team that could create something so amazing and still be known individually, but when they went out alone, they couldn't get that same level of accolade or accomplishment. Maybe Paul McCartney, but whatever. I still think the
Yeah,
Beatles are better
totally.
than him.
Yeah, I mean, like I think the Beatles, like for sure, outsold any record that Paul
Yeah,
McCartney would have put out. But yeah, it's so true. I mean, collaboration is a buzzword, but it's true that when you work together, you need to work within the team. Like
yeah,
doing it by yourself, yeah, you may go faster, but how far will you actually get, right?
yeah.
So yeah,
Might
great
not cross
point.
the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on and on about this,
Yeah.
and maybe we can chat about it another time. But yeah, so if people want to get a hold of you or want to reach out to you, or even if you're open to have a chat, like how would people get in touch with you?
LinkedIn, send me a message. I usually do respond to everybody if I can. If there's a ton of messages, obviously it's hard to get back to everybody, but I definitely read them, and I will. If you have questions, happy to help.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great things going on at Cash App. I've been just kind of following.
Hmm.
But yeah, congrats on your work that's going on there, and thanks again for joining me. Yeah, and hope people got some good nuggets. There was a lot of great stuff in this chat, and it wasn't so
I hope
bad,
so.
right, Parth? Think you were a little bit
It
nervous
wasn't
before
so
we went into
bad.
it.
No, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have written all these notes to myself. and it just like conversation, like I said, it just flows, right? Once you're in it and you're doing the work and the conversation, it's so natural that yeah. But
Yeah.
preparation helps. Preparation is a good thing. So always
Yeah,
do that.
definitely. So lots of lessons to learn. Um, Thanks again, Parth, and we'll
Yeah.
see you all next time. Thank you for checking out Creative Leadership with Heart. Just make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. We have a lot more content coming out. So if you do subscribe, you'll get notified when we have new episodes. All right, take it easy. See you in the next one.